Somewhere over Berlin, in the spring of 1945, the radio inside an American B-17 came alive with a call no one in that aircraft had expected to make. A silver shape was closing on the bomber stream from above, a jet, the German Messerschmitt 262, 540 miles per hour, faster than anything the United States had in the sky. The bomber pilot looked up through the cockpit glass. He saw the streak coming. He keyed his microphone. Red tails. That was all he said. 2 words. And the men he was calling were the men his own country had spent 20 years declaring incapable of flying that aircraft at all. This is the story of how that lie collapsed. It begins 20 years earlier in a quiet office at the Army War College in Washington, where an officer pressed his fingers to typewriter keys and began to write a sentence that would shape the lives of millions. The paper rolled forward, black ink struck white pulp, and word by word a doctrine took form. The Negro, the report said, was of inferior mentality. He possessed a weak character. He was, in his essential nature, subservient. Page after page followed. Pseudoscience dressed up as fact. The document declared that black men lacked the intelligence for technical work, the courage for combat, the discipline for command. It carried the seal of the United States Army. It bore the signatures of senior officers, and once filed, it became something far more dangerous than an opinion. It became policy. For the next 16 years, this report sat in the filing cabinets of the War Department. It was cited in memos, referenced in briefings, used to justify every refusal, every barrier, every closed door. It was not the rant of a single bigot. It was the considered judgment of an institution. By the late 1930s, the world was darkening. Hitler was on the move. Japan was tearing through China, and inside America, the contradiction had become impossible to ignore. A nation calling itself the great democracy, a nation preparing to fight tyranny abroad, a nation that denied basic rights to 13 million of its own citizens at home. Civil rights leaders began to hammer at this contradiction. The pressure built. Letters poured into the White House. Newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier put the words across their front pages in heavy black ink. Double V, victory abroad, victory at home. In 1939, Congress passed the Civilian Pilot Training Act. It funded flight schools across the country. Black colleges, by careful design, were excluded. The civil rights lawyers struck back. Lawsuits were filed. By 1940, 6 black institutions had been authorized to teach flying. One of them was the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. It was here that everything would change. On a clear spring morning, the 29th of March, 1941, a long black car rolled through the gates of Tuskegee.
1 month later,
the First Lady of the United States stepped out. She was there to inspect the program. Her advisors had warned her against it. They had warned her especially against what she was about to do next. Standing on the airfield was a man named Charles Alfred Anderson, 34 years old, self-taught. The chief flight instructor of the program. He was black, he was a civilian, and by the standards of the day, the idea of a black pilot lifting the First Lady of the United States into the sky was political dynamite. Eleanor Roosevelt looked at him. She smiled. "I always heard," she said, "that colored people couldn't fly airplanes." She paused. "I see you flying one. Take me up." The Secret Service erupted. They radioed Washington. They begged her to reconsider. The answer that came back from the White House was simple. The president had given up trying to control his wife years ago. Chief Anderson helped her into the front cockpit of a small yellow Piper Cub. The propeller spun, the engine caught, and for the next 40 minutes, Eleanor Roosevelt flew over the red Alabama earth in the hands of a black aviator. When they landed, a photographer captured the moment. Her smile was wide. His hand was steady on the cowling. The photograph traveled. It struck newspapers across the country like a hammer, and inside the White House, the president saw it. Within weeks, the budget for what would become the Tuskegee program was approved. A lie that had stood for 16 years had been broken by a 40-minute flight. But approval was not acceptance. The Army called it an experiment. That single word told you everything. An experiment is something you run to see if it fails. The deck was stacked. The instructors were chosen carefully. Most of them were white officers who shared the views of the 1925 report. They were there to gather data. The data they expected to gather was the data of failure. The base commander was a man named Noel Parrish, 33 years old, from Kentucky, white, and one of the few men in that uniform who did not seem to belong on either side of the line. Parrish demanded perfection. He pushed the cadets harder than any white program in America. While white cadets in other schools logged 200 hours to earn their wings, the men at Tuskegee logged 300. The washout rate at white schools sat around 40%. At Tuskegee, 60% of cadets failed out. The men who survived were not pilots. They were something more refined than that. They were instruments, filed sharp by the relentless pressure of knowing that one mistake, just one, could be used to shut the entire program down. Among them was a man who had been carrying this kind of pressure his entire life. His name was Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr., the son of America's first black general officer. 31 years old when he took command, quiet, reserved, eyes that had learned not to flinch. In 1932 he had entered West Point. The reaction had been immediate. The other cadets met. They voted, and they agreed to a punishment they reserved for those they wanted gone. The silent treatment. For 4 years no white cadet spoke to him outside of official duty. 4 years of meals taken alone in the mess hall. 4 years of marching in formation with men who would not acknowledge his existence. 4 years of rooming alone because no one would share quarters with him. He did not break. He graduated 35th in his class of 276. He took his commission. And in the spring of 1943, when the time came to ship the first squadron of black aviators to war, Benjamin Davis Jr. was the man they chose to lead them. The 99th Pursuit Squadron arrived in North Africa in April of 1943. They had crossed the Atlantic in a converted ocean liner. They had passed through Casablanca. They had finally reached a dusty airfield near Cape Bon in Tunisia, and they were placed under the command of a colonel named William Momia. Momia was 26, younger than Davis. White, a combat pilot himself with confirmed kills to his name. And from the moment the 99th arrived, he made his position clear. He did not give them new aircraft. He gave them P-40 Warhawks, battered, worn, hand-me-downs from squadrons that had moved on to newer machines. The P-40 was a good plane in 1940. By 1943, it was a flying museum piece. The German Messerschmitt 109 could climb faster, dive faster, and turn tighter. The Focke-Wulf 190 was worse, or better, depending on which seat you were sitting in. Momia gave them missions to match the aircraft. Coastal patrols, convoy escorts, long, empty loops over the Mediterranean where nothing ever happened, milk runs, the kind of work you give to pilots you do not trust with anything more. For weeks, the 99th flew these missions. They watched white squadrons take the real fights. They watched their own logbooks fill with hours and nothing else. Morale slipped, then it began to fall. And in the quiet moments between sorties, the question began to circulate among the men. Had they been sent here to fight, or had they been sent here to fail? July 2nd, 1943. The sky over Sicily. The 99th was escorting a flight of B-25 Mitchell bombers on a strike against a German airfield called Castelvetrano. The bombers crossed the coast. The flak began to come up in dark blooms, and then, dropping out of the high sun, 2 Focke-Wulf 190s appeared. They came down hard, lining up on the bombers from above. In one of the P-40s, a first lieutenant named Charles Bryan Hall saw them coming. He was 22 years old, from Brazil, Indiana, the son of a working family that had run out of money for his college tuition. He had been raised in a town where black men did not own homes on certain streets. He pushed his stick forward. The P-40 nosed over. He cut hard inside the path of the second Focke-Wulf. The German pilot saw him too late. Hall opened fire. 50 caliber tracers stitched across the German fuselage. The Focke-Wulf staggered. It rolled away. Then it fell in a long descending dive all the way to the earth below. When Hall landed back at base, the ground crews were waiting. They had heard it over the radio. Mechanics, armourers, cooks. They lifted him onto their shoulders. They carried him around the airfield in the dust and the heat. That evening, the squadron painted a single black cross on the side of his aircraft. It was the first. It would not be the last, but in a quiet office hundreds of miles to the west, William Mumya sat down at his desk. He began to write a report. It did not mention the victory. It did not mention the Focke-Wulf. It described the 99th as lacking aggressiveness, lacking discipline, unfit for combat. It recommended the squadron be removed from frontline duty. Permanently, the report travelled up the chain of command. It crossed desks. It was copied. It was forwarded. And it eventually landed on the desk of the most powerful airman in the United States military. General Henry Harley Arnold, 57 years old, commander of the entire Army Air Forces, the man with the authority to end the experiment with a single signature. In the autumn of 1943, the Tuskegee program was not on the verge of failing, it was on the verge of being killed by its own side. The report sat on Henry Arnold's desk through the holiday season of 1943. He read it twice, then he set it aside. He had a war to run, 40 divisions in motion. A bombing campaign over Germany consuming 300 American lives a week. The fate of a single squadron in Tunisia was not, in the calculus of high command, a matter of high priority. But the wheels of bureaucracy had begun to turn. Memos were drafted. Staff officers circulated recommendations. The Tuskegee experiment was being prepared very quietly for a quiet burial. The 99th would be pulled off the line. The 332nd, still in training back home, would never see combat. Then, on the 22nd of January 1944, 50,000 Allied soldiers waded ashore at a quiet stretch of Italian coastline called Anzio. And every plan on every desk in Washington became suddenly violently obsolete. The beachhead was a trap. By the 24th, the Germans had recovered from their initial shock. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had moved his armies south at a speed that astonished the Allied planners. By the end of the week, 50,000 American and British troops were pinned against the sea. Artillery rained down from the surrounding hills. The only thing standing between the infantry and total disaster was the air. The Luftwaffe knew this. They threw everything they had into the sky over Anzio. Wave after wave of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters streaked down from the north, swarming the beachhead at low altitude, hunting the troop transports, the supply ships, the field hospitals on the sand. The American fighter groups in Italy were stretched to breaking. Every aircraft was thrown into the rotation, and the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the unit William Mumya's report had declared unfit for combat, was suddenly indispensable. On the morning of January 27th, the squadron was scrambled. 15 pilots in their tired, porty Fort Warhawks lifted off from a dusty airstrip near Naples. They flew north along the Italian coast in the cold morning light. They climbed to 15,000 feet, and as they crossed the beach at Anzio, they saw what no man in the squadron had ever seen before. The sky was full of Germans. What happened in the next 10 minutes would not have been believed by any officer at the Army War College in 1925. Captain Clarence Jameson led the squadron into the German formation. 15 P-40s against a wave of Focke-Wulf 190s, the most advanced piston-engine fighters in the Mediterranean theatre. The math was simple. The P-40 was slower, it climbed worse, it dove worse. By every measurable standard of aerial combat, the Tuskegee pilots should have been overwhelmed. They tore the Germans apart. Lieutenant Willie Ashley fired, and a Focke-Wulf cartwheeled into the sea. Lieutenant Robert Diaz locked onto another and watched the canopy shatter. Lieutenant Howard Bohr hit one squarely in the engine. The German pilot bailed out into the Tyrrhenian Sea. Lieutenant Wilson Eagleson scored. Lieutenant Leon Roberts scored. When the radio chatter finally died down, the squadron had been credited with 5 confirmed victories that morning. The next day, January 28th, they did it again. 4 more Focke-Wulfs went down. Charles Hall, the lieutenant from Indiana, who had scored the first kill 7 months earlier, added 2 more confirmed victories to his name. The day after that, 3 more. In a span of 72 hours, the 99th Pursuit Squadron had destroyed 12 enemy aircraft. They had killed more Germans in 3 days than they had killed in the previous 7 months combined. The men who, according to William Momia, did not have the courage for combat. The numbers were impossible to hide. When the radio reports filtered back to Washington, the recommendation on Arnold's desk became a problem. A serious one. It had been written before Anzio. The data had been collected before Anzio. Now Anzio existed, and the data was suddenly, embarrassingly, wrong. Arnold did something rare for a senior officer in 1944. He ordered a real investigation. The Army Air Force's Statistical Control Unit was tasked with comparing the combat performance of the 99th to every other P-40 squadron operating in the Mediterranean theatre, every kill ratio, every sortie, every aircraft loss. The methodology was cold and precise. It accounted for the obsolete equipment. It accounted for the patrol missions. It accounted for everything Momia had used to mark the unit down. When the numbers came back, they told a story no one in command had expected. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was performing as well as any white squadron in the theatre. In some categories, they were performing better. The report was distributed. Copies travelled to the War Department, to the Joint Chiefs, to the offices of the senior commanders who had been preparing to pull the squadron off the line. The recommendation to disband was quietly withdrawn. William Momia's earlier assessment was filed and forgotten, and in a small footnote that would shape the next 18 months of the war, an order was given to send the men of Tuskegee to the front lines that mattered most, to the heart of the Reich itself. By the spring of 1944, the war in the air had become a war of bombers. The 8th Air Force in England was hitting the industrial cities of Western Germany. The 15th Air Force, based in Italy, was hitting everything south of the Alps. Ploiești, the oil fields of Romania that fueled Hitler's panzers, Vienna, Munich, the Skoda armaments plant in Czechoslovakia, the submarine pens at Toulon. Every day, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators lumbered north from the Italian airfields, carrying their bomb loads and their crews into the meat grinder of the German air defences. What they needed more than anything was fighter cover. The 332nd Fighter Group had been activated in October 1942. 3 squadrons of Tuskegee pilots had trained for over a year, waiting for their chance. In February 1944 they arrived in Italy. By May the order came down. The 99th would join them. 4 squadrons, the 99th, the 100th, the 301st, the 302nd. Together, they formed the largest concentration of black combat aviators in the history of the American military. Colonel Benjamin Davis Jr. was appointed group commander, but arriving was not the same as belonging. When the 332nd had first set foot in Italy in February of 1944, they had been sent to a muddy airfield called Montecorvino, south of Naples. The aircraft waiting for them on that field were not P-51 Mustangs, they were P-39 Aerocobras. The P-39 was the airplane no one wanted. It had been rejected by the British. It had been pushed out of frontline service in the Pacific. Its only remaining purpose was as a gift to the Soviets, who used it for low-altitude work on the Eastern Front. The 332nd was the only American fighter group in Europe still flying it. The aircraft had a fatal design flaw. Its engine was mounted behind the pilot. It had no turbocharger. Above 15,000 feet it was almost useless. It could not climb to where the bombers flew. It could not catch the Focke-Wulfs at altitude. It could only fly low, hunting trucks and trains, taking ground fire from every direction. The 332nd flew the P-39 for months. They lost good men to ground fire. They strafed bridges in northern Italy. They hit ammunition dumps. and every day white squadrons flying P-51s passed overhead on their way to Germany, while the men of Tuskegee stayed at low altitude, doing the work no one else wanted to do. In April, the P-39s were exchanged for P-47 Thunderbolts, better, heavier, but still not the long-range escort fighter they needed. On the 28th of May 1944, the group moved north to a new airfield, a place called Ramitelli on the Adriatic coast in southern Italy. It was a strip of dirt and prefabricated huts in a flat expanse of farmland. There was nothing to recommend it except its location. It was within fighter range of every target in the Reich that mattered. The 332nd had arrived where the war would be decided. And finally, in late June of 1944, after the men had spent 2.5 years training and fighting and dying for the right to take their place in the war that mattered, the new aircraft began rolling onto the field at Ramitelli. P-51 Mustangs, silver, the most advanced fighter in the American inventory. They had earned them 3 times over. Around the same time, the 15th Air Force issued a directive. Every fighter group would paint its tail section a distinctive color for identification in the chaos of formation flying. The 332nd was assigned red. They did not paint a stripe. They did not paint a band. They painted the entire tail section, a deep defiant crimson, from rudder to elevator, from the trailing edge of the wing to the very tip of the empennage. They painted the propeller spinners red, they painted the nose bands red, and when their formation lifted off from Ramitelli for the first time, what the world saw was a sky filled with red lightning. Colonel Davis gathered his men in the briefing tent. He stood at the front, lean, quiet, the same man who had endured what no white officer in that tent could imagine. He looked at the pilots who had come so far. He understood what they had been asked to do, to be perfect, to never make a mistake. To carry the weight of an entire race on their shoulders every time they climbed into a cockpit. He gave them an order that would have made other commanders furious. "Our job," he said, "is not to be aces." A pause. "Our job is to bring the bombers home." He laid out the doctrine. Stay with the bombers. Always, no matter what, no glory runs, no personal hunts. If a Focke-Wulf broke off from an attack, do not chase him. Stay in formation. Stay with the men in the heavy bombers above you, who cannot defend themselves. The pilots in the B-17s and B-24s have families. The wives and mothers of those crews are praying that someone gets them home. We will be that someone. It was a radical order. Across the entire American fighter force, every other group operated on the opposite principle. Pursue the enemy, rack up kills. The pilots who came back with the most painted swastikas on their fuselages were celebrated as aces. They got the medals, they got the press, they got the promotions. The doctrine Davis was laying out would deny his men those things. The men of the 332nd would accept it without argument. They had not come this far to be celebrities. They had come this far to be useful. Among them was a lieutenant named Lee Andrew Archer. He was 25 years old, from Yonkers, New York. Small in stature, with sharp eyes and a quiet sense of humor, and by every account of the men who flew with him, he was the most talented natural pilot in the entire group. By the autumn of 1944, Archer had 4 confirmed kills. He needed 1 more to become an ace. In the white fighter groups of the 8th Air Force, an ace was a celebrity. The Army flew them home for war bond tours. Their faces appeared on magazine covers. The 5th kill changed a man's life. On the 12th of October 1944, escorting bombers near Lake Balaton in Hungary, Archer and his flight partner Wendell Pruitt engaged a flight of German fighters. In the swirling fight that followed, Archer was credited with 2 more kills, 6 total. He was an ace twice over. The combat report was filed. Then it was changed. Somewhere in the chain of command, one of his kills was downgraded from confirmed to probable. Another was reassigned. By the time the paperwork was finalized, Archer's official total stood at 4, 1 short. He never made ace. To his dying day, Archer never publicly complained. He never accused anyone. When asked by journalists in his later years whether he believed his kills had been deliberately denied, he would only smile and say that the records were what they were. But the men who flew with him knew the truth. Across the entire group, dozens of pilots watched their chances at ace status slip away because they stayed with the bombers. The doctrine that made the 332nd legendary as escorts cost them their personal place in the history books. They chose to save lives instead. By the summer of 1944, the Red Tails were ranging deep into Europe. Munich, the bombers struck the factories. The 332nd held the sky above them. Vienna. The bombers came in from the south, threading through the gauntlet of flak. The Red Tails covered them all the way home. Ploiești. The oil fields of Romania, the most heavily defended target in the entire European theatre, ringed by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, patrolled by veteran German fighter pilots from Jagdgeschwader 51 and Jagdgeschwader 53. The 332nd flew there again and again. Word began to spread among the bomber crews. Briefing rooms at airfields across Italy started to buzz with a single question every morning before the mission. Who is escorting us today? The men who flew the heavy bombers were almost entirely white. They had been raised in the same country that had produced the 1925 War College Report. Many of them, when they first heard that the Tuskegee airmen were now their fighter cover, had been doubtful. Some had been worse than doubtful. But the doubts did not survive contact with the truth. The red-tailed Mustangs stuck with them. They did not break off. They did not chase glory. When a B-17 fell out of formation, smoke streaming from an engine, a pair of red tails would peel down and stay with that crippled aircraft all the way home, fighting off attackers in a long, slow journey through hostile sky. The bomber crews began to call them the Red Tail Angels. By late 1944, requests were arriving at 15th Air Force headquarters. Specific requests, bomber groups asking for the 332nd by name, asking for the men of Tuskegee. The men who had been called timid in a colonel's report a year earlier were now the most requested escort group in the Mediterranean. But the war was not finished with them. On the 12th of August 1944, a young first lieutenant named Alexander Jefferson lifted off from Ramitelli on what should have been a routine mission. He was 22 years old, from Detroit, Michigan. The son of a teacher, he had grown up in a middle-class black family on Detroit's west side, and he had earned his wings at Tuskegee with the same brutal discipline as every other man in the group. He was, on that morning, flying his 18th combat mission. The target was a German radar installation on the southern coast of France, pre-invasion work. The Allies were preparing for Operation Dragoon, the landing in Provence, and the radar sites had to be destroyed before the troops went ashore. Jefferson took his Mustang down low. The flak came up fast. A round of German 20mm caught his aircraft. The engine began to lose oil. Then it caught fire. Then it stopped. Jefferson rolled the canopy back. He bailed out at 1,500 feet. His parachute opened. He drifted down toward the French farmland below. The Germans were waiting. They took him to a holding cell, then to a train, then to an interrogation center near Frankfurt, deep inside the Reich. The center was called Dulag Luft. It was where the Luftwaffe processed every captured Allied airman. The interrogators there were Luftwaffe officers, many of them former pilots themselves, trained in the techniques of breaking men down through patience and information, rather than through violence. Jefferson was led into a small office. He sat down across from a German officer in a clean grey uniform. The officer opened a thick file. He looked up. He smiled. "Lieutenant Jefferson," he said. "From Detroit." Jefferson stared at him. The officer continued. He knew the address of Jefferson's parents in Detroit. He knew that Jefferson's father was a teacher. He knew his mother's maiden name. He knew the name of the airfield at Ramitelli. He knew the names of the squadron commanders. He knew that the 332nd had recently received P-51 Mustangs. He knew the colors painted on their tails. He knew everything. Jefferson sat very still and said nothing. The German officer closed the file. "You see," he said quietly, "we have been paying attention." In that small room in the heart of Nazi Germany, the war made a strange new sense to Alexander Jefferson. The enemy, he had been told, was an ignorant, bestial force was nothing of the kind. The Luftwaffe knew his name, his family, his base, his commanders. They had been studying the Tuskegee Airmen with the precision of professionals. He was moved east to a prison camp called Stalag Luft III near a town called Sagan in what is now Poland. It was the camp the British prisoners had nicknamed the Great Escape Camp. It was there, in the freezing barracks of a Nazi prison, that Alexander Jefferson would learn what it felt like to be treated as a man. For the first time in his life. While Alexander Jefferson sat in a wooden barracks in eastern Germany, the men he had flown with were preparing for the longest mission of their war. The target was Berlin. On the 24th of March 1945, the 15th Air Force was ordered to strike the Daimler-Benz tank factory in the German capital. It was the deepest penetration the 15th had ever attempted from Italian bases, 1,600 miles round trip, across the Alps, across Austria, across the dying heart of the Reich, all the way to the rubble-strewn capital of a regime that had only weeks left to live. The bomber stream would be massive. The escort assignment fell to the 332nd Fighter Group. 59 P-51 Mustangs lifted off from Ramitelli that morning, red tails catching the southern sun. By the time they reached Berlin, 43 would still be in formation. The others turned back by mechanical trouble across the long flight north. Colonel Benjamin Davis Jr. climbed into the lead aircraft. The pilots flew in tight formation north over the Adriatic, then west across the spine of the Alps, then deeper still into German airspace, threading through holes in the cloud, watching the white peaks slide away beneath them. Intelligence had warned them what was coming. Jagdgeschwader 7, the elite Luftwaffe interceptor unit, the only fighter group in the world equipped with the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 was a machine from another decade, a turbojet-powered aircraft with a top speed of 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. It could climb faster. It could attack from angles a piston fighter could not match. It carried 430mm cannons in its nose. A single hit from those guns could tear a B-17 in half. In the skies over Berlin, the Me-62 had become a ghost. A silver streak that appeared, struck, and vanished before any American pilot could react. To fight it head-on seemed impossible. The bomber stream crossed the Czech border. The flak began to come up. And then, dropping out of the high March sky, the jets appeared. It was the largest formation of Me-2262s the Luftwaffe had ever assembled for a single battle. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown saw them first. He was 23 years old, from Washington, D.C., the son of a dentist who had built one of the largest black-owned dental practices in the capital. He was flying as element leader in the 100th Fighter Squadron that morning, and he had spent weeks studying every piece of intelligence the Allies had gathered on the jet. He knew its weakness. The Me-262 was fast in a straight line, but it could not turn well. Its engines accelerated slowly. If a piston fighter could force it into a turning fight, the jet became vulnerable. Brown saw a 262 lining up on a bomber below. He keyed his microphone. Tally-ho! He pushed his Mustang into a dive, but he did not turn toward the jet. He turned away from it. The German pilot overshot, blasting past at 500 miles per hour. Brown whipped his Mustang around in a hard climbing reversal. The jet was now in front of him, climbing slowly, vulnerable, slow on the throttle response. Brown opened fire. His combat report described what happened next in 3 sentences. I pulled up at him in a 15-degree climb. I fired 3 long bursts. Almost immediately the pilot bailed out. A jet, the future of aerial combat. Brought down by a propeller fighter and a black pilot whose grandparents had been born into slavery. At nearly the same moment, in another sector of the battle, Lieutenant Earl Lane saw a second Me-262 cutting across the bomber formation. He had no good firing angle. The jet was traveling at high speed across his nose at a range of nearly half a mile. Hitting a target like that with machine guns was a feat of mathematics more than marksmanship. The lead required was extreme. The window was a fraction of a second. Lane fired anyway. The 50 caliber rounds traveled across the sky in a long flat arc. They met the Me-2 in a stretch of empty air. The jet shuddered. Then it began to come apart. Then it was gone. Then Lieutenant Charles Brantley scored a third. 3 jets in a single afternoon. To put that number in its proper places in history, consider this. Across the entire war, in every escort mission flown by every American fighter group from England to Italy, fewer than 30 Me-262s were credited as aerial victories. The 332nd Fighter Group, the unit William Momyer had once described as lacking aggressiveness, had destroyed 3 of them in a single afternoon. It was more jets than most American fighter groups would destroy in the entire war. For their performance over Berlin, the 332nd Fighter Group was awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation, one of the highest honors the United States military can bestow upon a unit. The mockery, if any had ever existed inside the Luftwaffe, was over. The men of Tuskegee had faced the future of aerial combat, and they had defeated it, but none of this reached Alexander Jefferson. In Stalag Luft III, deep in eastern Germany, Jefferson knew nothing of Berlin. He knew only the cold, the thin soup. The frozen wooden floors of barracks that had been designed to hold men until the war was over, and he knew something else, something he had not expected. The white American officers in the camp, the bomber pilots and navigators who had been shot down over Germany, treated him as one of their own. They shared their Red Cross parcels with him. They invited him to their bunks for card games. They asked him about his squadron. When they learned he had flown with the 332nd, more than one of them came up to him quietly and shook his hand and said the same words. "You guys saved my life." Jefferson later wrote about this in his memoir. He described what it felt like to receive that gratitude in a place where everything else had been stripped away. No rank mattered in Stalag Luft III. No skin color mattered. The barbed wire flattened every American into a single category: prisoner. In the heart of Nazi Germany, in a camp run by men who had been raised on the doctrine of racial purity, Alexander Jefferson experienced the first true equality of his American life. He never forgot it. In late January of 1945, with the Soviet Red Army approaching Sagan from the east, the German guards forced the prisoners of Stalag Luft III out into the snow. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below freezing. The men marched west on icy roads for days. Some did not make it. Those who did were eventually loaded onto trains and shipped south to another camp, Stalag 7A at Moosburg in Bavaria. On the 29th of April 1945, the lead tanks of the American 14th Armored Division, part of George Patton's Third Army, rolled through the gates of Moosburg. Jefferson watched them come. The wire was cut. The guards were gone. The war for him was finally over. He had survived. He was going home. The ship that brought him back to America docked in New York Harbor in late May. Jefferson walked down the gangway. He stood on the pier. He had not seen his country in nearly 2 years. A military policeman stepped forward to organize the disembarking soldiers into lines. He put the white men in one line. He put Jefferson in another. The war had not changed anything at all. Earlier that same spring, in April of 1945, while Jefferson was still being marched west across the German countryside, 60 black officers walked into the Officers' Club at Freeman Field, Indiana. The club had a rule. Black officers were not permitted to enter. The men entered anyway. They were arrested. Over the following days, more than 160 black officers, including a young lieutenant named Coleman Young, who would later become the first black mayor of Detroit, were arrested for the simple act of trying to use a club their commissions entitled them to use. It became known as the Freeman Field Mutiny. The men of Tuskegee had defeated jet fighters over Berlin. They could not yet defeat the rules of an officers' club in southern Indiana. When the books on the war were finally closed, the numbers on the 332nd Fighter Group were a stunning answer to every lie that had been told about them. Over 1,500 combat missions. 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, another 150 destroyed on the ground, a German naval vessel sunk with nothing but machine gun fire. 96 pilots awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. For decades afterward, a legend grew that the 332nd had never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters. It was a beautiful story. It was repeated in newsreels. It was carved into the public memory. In 2007, an Air Force historian named Daniel Hallman went back through the original combat reports. He counted carefully. The truth, he found, was less perfect than the legend. The 332nd had lost approximately 27 bombers to enemy aircraft over the course of their combat record. But the number was still the lowest in the 15th Air Force, lower than every white fighter group flying the same missions in the same skies. The legend had been wrong. The achievement was real. In 1948, 3 years after the war, President Harry Truman sat down in the Oval Office. He picked up a pen. He signed Executive Order 9981. With the stroke of that pen, the United States Armed Forces were officially desegregated. The forces that had once called black Americans inferior in the cold language of an Army War College report were now, by federal order, integrated. The men of Tuskegee had not won that fight alone, but they had carried it. They had made the case in fire and steel and discipline and the blood of friends. They had made it impossible for any honest officer in the Pentagon to repeat the old lies. The recognition that should have come quickly did not come quickly. For more than 50 years, the story of the 332nd Fighter Group was largely forgotten by mainstream America. The men aged. They became schoolteachers, lawyers, accountants, postmen. They watched a country slowly catch up to what they had done. They told their grandchildren the stories. They waited. On the 29th of March 2007, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow. By then, only about 300 of the original airmen were still alive to receive it. Many of them rolled into the Capitol Rotunda in wheelchairs. They stood when they could. They saluted when their legs would allow. Roscoe Brown was there, the man who had shot down the Me-62 over Berlin 62 years earlier. He was 85 years old. His hair had gone white, his hands shook. Years later, in an interview recorded near the end of his life, he was asked what he believed his unit had achieved. He thought about it for a long moment. "We did not just fight the Germans," he said. "We fought ignorance, we fought prejudice, we fought hatred. And in the end, we won all 3 battles." Roscoe Brown died in 2016. He was 94 years old. One of the last of the original Tuskegee combat pilots was a man named Charles McGee. He had flown 409 combat missions across 3 wars. He was promoted to the honorary rank of Brigadier General by an act of Congress in 2020, shortly before his death in January 2022. He was 102 years old. The lie that had been written in 1925 had not survived him. It had not survived any of them. The men who painted their tails red. The men who flew with discipline instead of glory. The men who stayed with the bombers when no other reward was given. They had taken a doctrine of racial pseudoscience and they had answered it with 112 victories in the air. They had answered it with the lives of bomber crews brought home to their wives. They had answered it with their silence in front of unjust officers, and their refusal in front of segregated officers' clubs, and their willingness, generation after generation, to keep flying. They had been set up to fail. They were expected to fail. And in the end, they did the one thing their doubters had never thought possible. They soared.